We understand that there are a number of Ukrainians who have drone expertise that have taken that to the Gulf to help the Gulf neighbours better combat, use that expertise to stop these Shaheeds. Now, initially I went, how does Ukraine, you're fighting a war. But I think this is a really shrewd move by President Zelenskyy, because he needs help in the war. He needs money. He needs weapons. The Middle East has money and weapons, but needs expertise. And I think President Zelenskyy will have created a lot of goodwill amongst those Middle East countries. They'll be more inclined to try to help him now in the battle against Russia. And also, one of the events I talked about it with the Polish embassy, that was all about how the Polish learning about how Ukraine are battling with drones. And also, we don't think we'll have the same war that Ukraine is having with Russia. But actually, rather than having drones that are literally carrying a hand grenade around and delivering it through a window, if you actually think of drones as nodes in a battle space ecosystem, so those nodes now all feed in information, so create a much more detailed picture of the battle space. Some of those drones might be watching, some of them may be listening, some of them may be listening on radio, some of them may be jamming. Now all of a sudden you're creating, these drones aren't just flying around and blowing things up, they're how you control the battle space. I used to fly close air support aircraft, fighter jets. Why would you use fighter jets to do close air support in the future when actually you might be able to do it all using drones? So I think there's some really interesting lessons that come out. But there's no doubt at all that the expertise that your people have gained in Ukraine fighting Shaheeds is now being translated. And there's some expertise that we have in this country that can take out Shahed drones for a fraction of the price of a missile. A lot of that capability is now being deployed quickly to the region as well.
However, US President Donald Trump says that he doesn't need any kind of support from Ukraine. He doesn't need European allies. He doesn't need NATO to help him to solve his problem, right? To unblock the Strait of Hormuz. Is he right?
So I was in the military for a long time, and regularly you'd have to work out where were your main threats. So Russia and China were our main threats. And you would war game how a war against Russia, how a war against China might be fought. What would be the role of America? What equipment, what capability, how many ships, how many tanks, how many aeroplanes, and that would feed what shape your military was made. And we used to war game what happened if there was a war against Iran. And indeed, I have played Iran sometimes in those war games. It was inevitable, because every time I did the war game, Iran got beaten up militarily. It has no answer to American military might. But every time it came down to the Straits of Hormuz, because that is a natural choke point where 20% of the world's oil and more of the world's natural gas go through. And as soon as you stop the flow of trade there, it has international implications. So this outcome was entirely predictable. The US military would have war gamed, would have known that from the start. So the question is, did President Trump even listen to his military advice at the time? Because what looks increasingly likely is that he didn't, that he thought he'd be able to go in to Iran the way that they went into Venezuela, pluck Maduro, end of story. And the normal way that these things happen is our military pull our politicians aside. What is your strategic objective? Military is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So the military will do their job, providing you go the day after, what are you going to do? listening to Trump talk, it's very difficult to work out what his strategic objectives were. Was it regime change? Well, they delivered that on day one. They severed the leadership of all of the Ayatollah Khamenei and all his family and all of the seniors. But they didn't stop. Was it to stop Iran ever developing a nuclear weapon? Well, you can set their program back a day, a week, a month, or a year, but intent is this. You can't stop them wanting to do it. They can't unlearn what they have learned. So the question is, what is this continued military campaign actually aiming to achieve? Because the Straits of Hormuz, you can't easily solve that with military means. So it has to be political dialogue. And it doesn't look like President Trump's got any appetite for that. So I'm not entirely clear, and I'm not even sure President Trump is entirely clear what his outcome is. I think he thought that there would be an uprising the moment America bombed Tehran. I know some Iranian folks. There's a young lady, Tara, who works in Sky, and she said, you fail to understand the Iranian people if that's what you think is going to happen. They've got no guns, they've got no weapons, they've been slaughtered the last time they jumped up. The regime's still in place, maybe different people, but it's still there. So to expect the people to rise up is naive. So now you've got a situation where President Trump's trying to get the international community in. They're going, hang on a minute, you broke it, you fix it. And Trump's recognizing, I think, that it's a lot easier to start a war than it is to end it.
Has President Trump lost control over this war?
I'm not sure he's lost control, but even on the end of the first day, President Trump was telling everybody that we won. We've won already. End of day one, we've won. And I think what he's been seduced is by the military story. There's no doubt that the US military dominates Iranian military. The Iranians' air defenses have been rolled back. American air power can operate wherever it likes over Iran. Iran's got no answer. America can strike targets on the surface or below the surface or above the surface whenever they like. And therefore, America's been making films demonstrating, showing off what they can do. So militarily, I'm sure they'd say that was a great success. But strategically, has that military action delivered the outcomes that President Trump wanted? And the answer plainly is no. President Trump's claiming that the Iranians are now just looking for a way out and want to negotiate. The Iranian president was saying, we don't want to negotiate. When America's finished and apologized to us, then maybe we'll stop. So I don't think time is not on President Trump's side. Neither is the supply of weapons. And therefore, I think the balance at the moment is tipping away from America and towards Iran. And there's a grave risk, I think, that this will come to define President Trump's presidency.
Excuse me. From your perspective, can US really win this war?
What do you think win means?
For example, unblock the Strait of Hormuz, the most difficult problem for President Trump.
So we don't have time on this podcast to look at in the detail, but let me tell you that you either do that by putting a convoy together and destroyer ships that provide a shield for that convoy, and that you comb the sea for mines, and you hope that none of your ships will be targeted. If you look at the number of ships that go through the Straits of Hormuz, the size of the ships, the vulnerability of the ships, the number of military ships available, it's an incredibly dangerous operation. There is no doubt that some of the ships would be hit. And an environmental disaster would ensue. I don't think that's, you might decide, well, we'll accept that a few tankers get blown up, but the rest will get through. The tanker wars, I think it was back in the late 1980s, there were 4 years worth, but I think it was over 400 merchant ships were targeted in that time. You just can't see the appetite of America doing that. So that's not feasible. If you wanted to solve this problem long term, Iran can't, and say that Iran can't do this again, you've got to invade Iran. You've got to annex a large part of Iran that's next to the Straits of Hormuz and either side of it. A belt of land so that you control the territory on the far side of the Straits of Hormuz. That would permanently solve the problem, but you'd put a lot of boots on the ground to do that. Boots on the ground is a long-term commitment. They would be targeted. There would be US casualties. And President Trump got elected under the banner that he's the president of peace, that I've solved all these wars. I don't think there'd be very much, if any, public support in America for that sort of footprint of Trump getting America with its fingers firmly in the mangle. That's very difficult to see an outcome. So I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but most of my military colleagues think what will happen is that President Trump will wake up one morning, declare victory, and walk away from the withdraw his forces and walk away.
Has this war revealed US military weaknesses?
I think it has, yes. I mean, well, we've got to be careful here. It's a bit like saying, is the war in Ukraine, is that the way that wars are going to be fought in the future? No, it's not. I think the question is, can air power alone deliver the objectives that President Trump was seeking to achieve? And the answer is plainly no. Air power, it allows you to surgically strike your enemy's capability. It minimizes the risk of your casualties on your own side. And you can be very measured, but also brutal in the way that you conduct the war. But unless you put boots on the ground, you don't have enduring effect. And I think most military scholars know the lessons of history that you can't do this without putting boots on the ground. And therefore, if you know you haven't got the appetite to put boots on the ground, then don't do it. And this goes back to, I'm pretty confident that the American military, they are a very, very professional, capable bunch of individuals. They run the biggest military power in the world. They can do anything. They will have wargamed this. They will know exactly what was going on. So I think the real question is that President Trump must have ignored the advice to him. So now they're going to be working out how do you extract yourself from this? And I think that's the trick for Trump. So yes, has it exposed the limits of American air power? Yes. But I wouldn't underestimate the awesome military might that America has. And if it was to put boots on the ground and involve its navy properly, there's no nation in the world that can stop it. But appetite for casualties, Afghanistan taught America, Vietnam taught America. Nobody has an appetite for that unless it's a war of national survival. And this is not a war of national survival.
US has used years' worth of key munitions, including Tomahawk missiles, during this war. From your perspective, does this sound sustainable? And can US fight different wars simultaneously, for example, against Iran, against China? If Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan, would American soldiers be ready?
Yeah. I think one of the things that, let's look at my country first. So the UK, we looked at certain wars that we were prepared to fight. And we made some assumptions about how long they'd last for, and therefore how many weapons we would need to last. The war in Ukraine and now the war in Iran have demonstrated that we were horribly wrong, that actually we had nowhere near enough weapons. We had good capabilities in ships, tanks and aeroplanes, but the weapons stockpiles, not even close. America, I think, has always spent a lot more, not only in terms of the billions of dollars. I think it's a $1.5 trillion budget that's going to go in front of Congress shortly. Eye-watering amounts of money. But for most countries like mine and like yours, that's not possible. And therefore, even America has a limited supply of stockpiles. And I think one of the really interesting questions that's cropped up over the last 18 days is that America has been using a lot of its air defense missiles to counter Iran's ballistic missile threat, because Iran had a lot of ballistic missiles. And although Trump said, we can quadruple the output of our defense industries, if you look at the rate of consumption of those missiles and the ability of American industries to, even if they quadruple the output, they can't keep pace. And even if I said, you're running a munitions factory, you're Lockheed Martin, and you're producing 17 Patriot missiles a week. If I say to you, right, next week, I want 60 of those missiles, not 17, you'll look at me and say, that's all jolly interesting, I'll take your money, but all the subcontractors, the people who make all the various sections, they can't suddenly sell me a load more. I don't have the factory big enough to build your 60. In a year's time, I'll be able to ramp up production, but I won't be able to do it in a week's time. So for Trump to say this, we can last forever, is just not true. I do think there are some weapons that America can churn out quickly. But I think this is less about cost for the cost of the war and more about numbers, because in contrast, if America can produce 17 Patriots a week, my understanding is that Iran can produce about 5,000 Shaheeds every month. So it's much bigger production facility. So you've got to find a way of tackling that. Now, one of the reasons I think that the American campaign has been going so heavily after Iran's missile storage and also missile production is to stop Iran putting these things into the air. Because as soon as they put ballistic missiles into the air, you have to use an expensive missile to shoot it down. And they've used this term, do you catch the arrows or do you shoot the archer? And they're trying to take out these missiles before they get into the air. And I think that's probably quite wise.
From your perspective, why did they make this mistake in the matter of intercepting cheap drones? Did they underestimate this Iranian Shahed drone technology? Ukraine has been defending its own country against these drones for years. Why didn't you just ask Ukraine for help beforehand, before the war began?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think let's take ourselves away from the Iranian war. Let's look at how does my country, the UK, prepare itself for the future. We have, ever since the Cold War ended, we've been involved in wars of choice. We've gone overseas. We've done expeditionary warfare. So we've gone to Iraq, we've gone to Afghanistan, we've gone to Bosnia, we've gone to Sarajevo. So we have a defense that's configured around taking our forces a distance away and then fighting. We have the aircraft carriers because they can then take our fighter jets, because we know they're not under threat, because the sort of wars we've been conducting against people that can't target our ships. But all of a sudden now you wake up and go, Russia has now invaded Ukraine. It's a very different threat. Now we are threatened here in the UK. And that's raised a huge number of questions, that we've got a military that's not configured to defend the UK. It's configured to go and do expeditionary warfare. And that's led to a degree of panic. How big an army do we need? How do we create air defense systems? Do we configure air defense systems against a Shahed drone threat, or against a ballistic missile threat, or against a small drone threat, or is it spider's web, jumping out of ISO containers and coming onto it creates some really profound questions, and you can't afford to do all of it. Now, we as an island probably believe the ballistic missile threat is a major one, because there are a lot of other countries that might shoot down Shaheds before they got to us against our natural enemies. So for us, there's a lot of conversations going on with Ukraine and Poland about what lessons should we learn and how do we prepare. Now you take that to the Iran case, I think it's probably fair to say that most European countries didn't see Trump declaring war on Iran. And therefore, we weren't well prepared for that. It's also, I don't think many countries, even Trump, probably believed that Iran would attack its neighbours, which is a bit naive when you go, well, there's lots of US military bases around the region. If you've launched attacks from there, then that makes them targets. So I do think that there was a slight shock about the timing of this, the Iranian response to that, and therefore suddenly finding ourselves having to tackle Shahed drones. But once again, even though we think they started the war with over 80,000 Shahed drones, if you can take out the areas where they're stored, if you can take out the factories, and unlike Ukraine, we do have a lot of weapons, certainly the Americans do, and a lot of space-based detection systems and spies on the ground. I wouldn't underestimate how many of those have been brought to bear. Quite what stocks Iran still has, I don't know. Are we rushing to get out new capabilities helped by Ukraine? Yes, we are. But yes, it has been a bit of a reaction rather than planning for this eventuality.
If Vladimir Putin fires 500 or 1,000 Shahed drones at United Kingdom, what will happen? What will you do?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, bluntly, at the moment, we don't have a defence against it. Now, don't forget, as you guys know better than I, if you lie on your back with a machine gun, you can shoot them out of the skies, but you've got to see them coming. Now that the original Shaheds were petrol-driven propeller, I think some of the ones you're facing now have got little jet engines in them, so they go a little bit faster. Also, Russia's managed to change the colour of them and make them a bit more difficult for radars to pick up. They're getting more expensive, but they're also getting more capable. And I think that's going to raise a lot of questions about how do you configure the defences in your country. But I return to the theme that one of the themes I regularly talk about in interviews is that we have no defence against ballistic missiles in this country. And often the interviewers say, well, hang on a minute, Israel's got loads and Ukraine's got loads. And you go, right, who provides those? America. Providing with Patriot systems, with THAAD, or with Aegis. There's three main systems there. Israel's a very small country, so they can put an iron dome over the top of it. It's more difficult to protect the whole of Ukraine, but if you position some stuff around Kyiv and maybe Lviv. But honestly, nothing. And if a ballistic missile was fired towards London, we could track it, we could watch it, but we couldn't shoot it down. And that is a big shock to some people in this country. We used to have that capability. We don't today. And the British government has put £1 billion aside to look at missile defence. Do you know what a Patriot system costs? £1 billion. So that sounds like a lot of money, but you'd buy one Patriot system. Where would you put it in the UK? London. House of Parliament. Wembley. I'm a rugby fan. Let's call it Twickenham. I mean, it's a facetious, but it doesn't even touch the surface. It doesn't touch the sides of the sort of capability that we would need in this country. So it's going to take at least a decade of investment to get this country back ready to deter our nation's enemies. And that leaves us vulnerable. And that's a really big issue for this country.
Is also Europe and NATO ready for a war with Russia, against Russia?
Well, yes. And the only reason I say yes is because collectively NATO is incredibly powerful. If you look at the member nations of NATO, if you add up all of everything we've got, it's pretty impressive. And I look at, for example, Red Flag is a big exercise that's done in America, fighter jets. I've done it many times. And I know people are doing it regularly these days. You turn up there with your fighter jets, your squadrons bristling with capability, and you are with 100 other airplanes flying across a major bit of airspace to go and bomb a load of targets with real bombs. And you have Red Air, Americans flying all sorts of adversary aeroplanes. Day one, they shoot us all out of the sky. You go back to the bar that night feeling very sad. By the end of 2 weeks, you are getting through and you are completing the missions. The training we get in the West is second to none. We have some excellent equipment, some excellent people, fantastic technologies. And I'm very confident that the Russians have no answer to that at all. So, no, wouldn't just be about an air war, but the disadvantage for Ukraine is that you don't have a functioning air force that can deter the Russian adversary. Doing a great job with what you have, but you can't secure local air superiority or air control. I'm confident the West could do that, and that is something that would stop Russia in its tracks.